everybody. Thank you for coming today. Dear Professor Elhanan Helpman, Galen Elstone Professor of International Trade at Harvard University, dear Professor Jaume Ventura, dear students and members of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, on behalf of Banc Sabadell and Conseller d'Economia, Mr. Andreu Mascolell, first of all, on behalf of Banc Sabadell, I would like to give a warm welcome to all of you this evening. In particular, I wish to express my sincere thanks to Professor Helpman for participating in the 27th edition of the Barcelona Graduate School Lecture Series. The topic of the lecture, International Trade Firm-Level Perspectives, is one of which Professor Helpman is a true pioneer and one of which he has worked extensively. I'm sure that our speaker today will provide us with valuable insights on the importance of firms, not only to international trade, but also to international economics in general. These issues are, in my opinion, of prime importance from both an academic and from an applied policy point of view. And in particular are of extremely importance and very relevant for the economic situation today, and especially for Spain, Spain within Europe. And I hope you all enjoy this privileged evening. Thank you very much. Professor Ventura, if you...
Thanks. Good evening. Let me just, I have the role of introducing Elhanan Helpman, and I think that he actually doesn't need any introduction. Elhanan Helpman is one of the world-leading economists, period. He's one of those few economists that have been able to take an area of research and shaped it, tell us what the problems are, show us what the solutions are, show us what's the path ahead, and create a school of people that has been following him for decades now. Back in the late 1970s, 1980s, Elhanan was one of the leaders of the school of thought that created the new trade theory. The models that he developed together with Paul Krugman and the textbooks that everybody that has done trade theory, and I can see quite a few faces here that I know that have done trade theory, have gone through. These are the models that we're using today still as the workhorse of the field. Not happy with that revolution, which would make a fabulous career for anybody, he went on and said, well, these models should be dynamic. These models should not only introduce imperfect competition, not only introduce the tools of game theory into it, but we needed to make dynamic, and he joined another revolution in economics at the time, a revolution of economic growth, what is called the new growth theory, and took this new growth theory and made it in the open economy. He's one of the leading contributors of that group as well, together with Philippe Aguillon, who today is sitting also here as well, and Paul Romer and Robert Barro and others. But that's not all. I mean, that would be already two great careers in economics. So Elhanan went on to the third. And he said, well, we not only need models that introduce imperfect competition, models that are dynamic, but we need to think also about political economy. And the work, he worked in these models of growth with Gene Grossman at Princeton, and he teamed up again with Gene Grossman to produce a series of papers and books on political economy that actually open up a new field in the area of trade. These papers and so on are basically the backbone under which today we work on models of political economy and trade. This is a third magnificent career in economics. After that, he's done a bunch of other things, and I think that you guys prefer to hear him than to keep hearing me praising the many contributions that Elhanan has done, but he has done major contributions to unemployment theory recently, to organization of the firm, which is what he's going to be talking about, how the organization of the firm and thinking about the firm seriously can help us address issues on international trade. He's also made contributions, these are a little bit farther away in time, on issues on debt, which are very relevant nowadays in Europe, on issues of finance, and so on. His influence has gone beyond the papers. He's also a great educator. I can see here a bunch of people, including myself, that have learned trade theory from him and that have understood the field through his eyes and through his teachings. I think that's another way in which he has been extremely influential. Not surprisingly, there is here a huge list in a resume of 24 pages about all the positions and honors that he has received, and probably these are fewer than the ones that he truly deserves. I'm going to, he's a member of the Israeli Academy of the Science and Humanities, foreign honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, corresponding fellow of the British Academy, member of the European Academy of Science and Arts, distinguished fellow of the American Economic Association, president of the Israeli Economic Association, president of the Economic Metric Society. He has a number of honorary doctorates. I'm going to stop here. You get the picture, and I tell you, get ready for enjoying a magnificent treat today, and give a big welcome to Elhanan Helpman. Welcome.
I'm going to take you on a trip. And the trip is about international trade theory, where it started and where we stand today. So traditional approaches to international trade focused on sectoral trade flows. And as we all know, David Ricardo, who is considered to be the founder of trade theory, looked at variations across sectors in productivity, and he made predictions about sectoral level of trade flows, clothing versus wines and things like this. Now, his approach was replaced many years later by a Swedish economist, and Eli Heckscher published a fascinating paper in 1919, which is one of the nicest papers that I have ever read, which provides a very elegant verbal analysis of how factor proportions differences. So Eli Heckscher proposed this approach to substitute or complement Ricardo, which said the differences in factor proportions across countries can drive trade. And this was elaborated by his former student Bertil Ohlin, who wrote a famous dissertation and then an even more famous book in 1933, where he integrated the Eli Heckscher approach into a Walrasian equilibrium system. And this is how we got the factor proportions to international trade that dominated thinking on the subject for most of the 20th century, basically. And one interesting thing about it was that it was mainly theoretical. And a lot of the empirical studies that were carried out at the time, they had a very vague relationship to the theory itself. And a big sort of step about it, concerning the evidence, was a book that Ed Limmer published in 1984. So think about it. Eli Heckscher, 1919, and the first major study, empirical study, comes out in 1984. And even this one doesn't provide the proper test of the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, but it generates the data that one needs for this type of examinations. In any case, Limmer and two of his former students in 1987 provide the first test of the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, and unfortunately, the results are negative. So this was quite unfortunate. But then another student of Ed Limmer, Dan Treffler, publishes a paper in 1995 where he ratifies to some degree these negative results. It doesn't restore them fully, but ratifies it to some degree. And then there is a bunch of studies whereby by 2001, Davis and Weinstein show that with a bunch of corrections, you can sustain essentially the predictions of this theory, especially when viewed from the point of view of what we call factor content of trade flows, which makes it more appealing for empirical analysis. When you think about Ricardo's contribution, from the empirical point of view, it's even worse. The empirical studies of Ricardo's insights were basically non-existent, until in the 1960s there were a bunch of studies by McDougall and then by Stern, and they were very vaguely related to Ricardo himself. And only in 2002 there is a paper published by Eaton and Kortum which provides a stochastic approach to the Ricardian theory, and this one can essentially be brought to the data. It was constructed in a way that enables one to bring it to the data. So in any case, the story is that for most of the 20th century, we had these two approaches, one based on factor proportions, the other on productivity variations, exogenous productivity variation across sector, I should emphasize, and they were focused on sectoral trade flows. Then came the sort of big change that was motivated by two types of observations. One observation is that in the data, there were very large flows of what we call intra-industry trade. This observation was due to Grubel and Lloyd, who published a book in 1975, where they collected very detailed data on trade flows, and they devised an index which can split the flows into what we call intra-industry versus intersectoral. So intersectoral is the country exports clothing and imports wine, which is what Ricardo thought about. Intra-industry flows are when a country exports chemicals and then imports chemicals. It exports electronics, it imports electronics. And when you have these two-way flows, you can decompose it into how much you have intra-industry and how much you have across sectors. So this little table shows you the share of intra-industry flows for a number of countries. For France, it's over 77%. For Germany, it's over 72%, and so on. And actually, if you take many countries, it will be very large. There are some countries which are whose trade is resource-based, like Australia, which have a lower share. But as you can see from here, it's still substantial, about 30%. The other observation which led to a revision of the trade theory was the observation that a lot of trade takes place across countries with very similar factor compositions, very similar levels of development. So in this little table, what you see is exports, say, from North America, which overall to the world, it's about $1.4 trillion, and 824 billion of this is to North America, and over 200 to Europe. So overall, most of these exports are to rich countries, from rich countries to rich countries. You look at Europe, which has about $4.3 trillion worth of exports in this year, and then you see that the great majority of it is to other European countries and to North America. So the issue then was that if you think that trade is driven by differences across countries, you should observe a lot of trade between countries which look very different from each other and little across countries which look very similar. What these type of data show you is most of trade is really across countries which are very similar. So these type of observations triggered the rethinking of international trade, which generated what Jaume described as the new trade theory. The foundations for this actually come much earlier. Bela Balassa, who was a Hungarian economist working in Johns Hopkins, wrote in 1967 a book about the process of integration in Europe. And what he noted is that as the trade barriers were removed, most of the adjustment took place within sectors rather than across sectors. And then he came up with a little verbal story of why it might have taken place in this way. And in effect, if you read it carefully, he actually had in mind exactly the type of elements that were built into the trade models later on. So what are these trade models? The two contributions that first constructed these type of models, which allowed for product differentiation, essentially, and monopolistic competition, was a paper by Paul Krugman in 1979, and a chapter in a book that Kelvin Lancaster published in exactly in the same year. And there's no distinction almost between the two, except for assumptions about preferences, for example. But the logic is exactly the same type of logic, and they were designed to handle exactly the same type of questions. Now, later on, these insights were integrated with the factor proportions. So this generated a much sort of richer structure that allowed scholars to generate theoretical predictions that in principle could be brought to the data. And these predictions were new in the sense that by construction, the models predicted a lot of intra-industry trade and trade across countries with very similar factor endowments, but they had a bunch of subsidiary predictions, which I don't have time to spell out, and people could test them and found that they were consistent with the data. So this is the background for the more recent work, which I want to explain in more detail. So the background is that in the models of the 1980s, what happened is that scholars did introduce firms into the economic models. However, when it came to predictions, they were concentrated on sectoral outcomes. So there were individual firms in the sectors, but the predictions that were derived from them were about sectoral outcomes, and this is also essentially what people took to the data. Now, the reason that it worked out this way is that for the particular issues in which people were interested at the time, there was a sense that symmetry of firms within an industry will be a simplifying assumption that will not damage the desirable outcomes. As long as you are interested in sectoral outcome, it looked at the time that this is an acceptable simplification. And in many ways, it was. Except that what happened is that in the 1990s, new data sets became available, which essentially were not available earlier on. These were firm-level data sets, and when you could measure in these data sets how firms vary within an industry and how this variation relates to foreign trade and later on to foreign direct investment, which is a topic I want to discuss. So Bernard and Jensen, they were the first scholars who worked on these data. They worked on American data. And later on, these studies were repeated on other countries' data sets, and the outcomes looked very much the same, at least qualitatively, so to speak. Obviously, quantitatively, there were some variation. So what they found out what people found out in these various data sets is that exporters in an industry look quite different from non-exporters. This is the punchline of this. And also, if you look at multinationals, they also look quite different. So in principle, there is some heterogeneity. So in particularly, if you look at this data, only a small fraction of firms export. And this is true pretty much across the board with some variation. So there are some countries like, say, Norway, which has pretty large fractions of exporters. Exporters, despite the fact that they export, they still sell a lot of their stuff in the domestic market. So they export only a fraction of their output. They are typically bigger and more productive than non-exporters, both in terms of labor productivity and in cases where total factor productivity was measured, also in terms of total factor productivity. And typically, exporters pay higher wages. So there is a sort of systematic relationship between the average wages that a firm pays and whether it exports or not. And when you look at multinational corporations, what you see is that they are even bigger and more productive typically than exporters. And as we know, they play an increasing role in foreign trade. In the US data, for example, trade is just dominated by the multinationals. So just to show you a little bit of this, what we have here is the fraction of exporting firms in the manufacturing sectors of the various countries. So what you see here is that in the US, about 18% of the firms export. In Norway, as I said, it's bigger. And in France, Japan, Chile, Colombia, and many other countries, it's a fraction of this magnitude, around 20%, again, with some variations. So a country like Brazil, it's even lower. They had, in some years, only about 5% of the firms exported. In others, it could go up to 9%, but it was quite small. If we look at the difference between exported and non-exporters, if you look at the second column, what it basically says is that exporters are twice as large on average than non-exporters in terms of employment. This is for the US. Their shipments or revenue are about twice as large as non-exporters, and so on. You go down the column and you see what we call exporter premium. I'll come back to this later, so I don't want to spend much time on this. The other sort of interesting thing is that more recent studies of trade liberalization found things which are quite similar to the things that Balassa found during the European integration, in the first stages of European integration. Namely, a lot of reallocation within industries as compared to across industries. And there are, although one can talk about many different facets of this, there are two empirical findings which are pretty striking. So one is that in almost all the studies, what you observe is that when a country liberalizes its trade, when a country liberalizes its trade, I put it here. When a country liberalizes its trade, what it tends to do is push out the smaller and less productive firms from the industry. They basically exit. And so this feature was found in various countries. Here I bring some examples: Taiwan, Colombia, Mexico, Morocco. It's true also about Canada. The other feature is that you get within an industry market share reallocated from the less productive to the more productive firms. So there are two things. It's a two-pronged, very strong effect. The bad, or not bad, but low productivity firms get out, and market shares get reallocated to the bigger and more productive firms, many of them who are exporters. And this is true in various countries. Again, you see Chile, the US, and Canada. So this sort of raised a bunch of questions. We have these new data sets. There are some patterns in these data which are common across countries, and they are related to the fact that firms within the same, even narrowly defined industries, they are not identical. And there's some systematic relationship between whether they participate in foreign trade or not and the firm characteristics. So this raised a various questions on how can one explain it. And the most appealing explanation came from a very famous paper of my colleague, Mark Melitz. It took a lot of work to make him my colleague, yes? But it worked out. In which he developed an economic model which starts essentially from the type of models that were developed in the 1980s and adds to it a set of features. Okay? And the outcome of this analytical model is that if you analyze it, you get predictions which are consistent with all these features that I mentioned before that people found in the data. So how did he enrich it? So the first thing, obviously, if you have a difference between exported and non-exporters, you have to introduce into the analytical framework firm heterogeneity. So he introduced firm heterogeneity. And the way he did it was he thought about an industry where firms enter, they pay some setup cost. And then after entry, they discover how productive they are. And once they know how productive they are, they choose whether to stay in the industry, because if they stay, they have to bear some fixed cost. So they may choose to leave and forego the entry cost. But if they stay, they have to choose a strategy. Are they going to serve only the domestic market, or are they going to export as well? So this becomes an endogenous decision of the firm. So there are these fixed costs of operation. And importantly, there are fixed costs of exporting. So if you want to export to Germany, you have to bear some fixed costs to set up a network, a service facility maybe. If you want to then export to Japan, you have to do it again. So you have to replicate these fixed costs to each country to which you go. And after entry, you choose the strategy, whether you go to a foreign country or you don't. And actually, you can choose to which countries you go. In the simple version of the model, everything is symmetric. But then in the generalizations, there's a lot of asymmetry. And this doesn't obviously hurt the predictions. So the outcome of this analysis was that indeed, the least productive firms exit. They don't stay in the industry because they cannot cover the fixed cost of operation. Then the most productive choose to export and also sell in the domestic market. And this is why you can get a situation where even the exporters sell majority of their wares in the domestic market. And then intermediate productivity firms, they forego exporting because they cannot cover the fixed cost of exporting, and they just serve the domestic market. So you get this sorting pattern from the analytical model, which is exactly the type of sorting pattern that we observe in the data. So then if you take this type of model, you can ask the question, what happens if a country like this liberalizes trade, or for some other reason there's a reduction, a multilateral reduction in the variable trade costs or the fixed trade costs. And here it gets very interesting results in view of the evidence that we have. So roughly speaking, what happens is if you liberalize trade, it becomes cheaper to trade. Then obviously the firms engaged in foreign trade, they expand. When they expand, they have to hire more resources. When they try to hire more resources, they bid up the resource cost in the country relative to prices. When they bid up the resource cost, the domestic firms which don't export are not compensated for these higher costs because their demand for their wares has not increased. So they get squeezed. They get squeezed. The least productive get squeezed the most. They leave the industry. So this is the effect one that I indicated earlier on. The other thing is that you get exactly a market share reallocation from the less productive to the more productive firms, and especially to the exporters. So the interesting thing here is that because the industry loses the least productive firms and the more productive firms get a higher weight, average industry productivity rises. So the process of trade liberalization becomes linked now with average productivity. So this is a prediction. People didn't look at it before. And also interesting that real income always goes up under these circumstances. So you get what we call gains from trade, or from trade liberalization in this particular outcome. So the most interesting new prediction is about what happens to average productivity. And so people started to look into this. And I'll show you some numbers for Canada. So there are a number of studies. Dan Treffler, whom I mentioned before, was a pioneer of these empirical studies in Canada. So he did study the trade agreement between Canada and the US, the free trade agreement, not NAFTA, but the one from 1989. And he could calculate, using very detailed firm-level data, what happened exactly to market shares, who left the industry, who stayed in the industry, and thereby make a calculation of average productivity. And what he found is the following. In the first two lines, we have the effects of the two responses that I mentioned before. Exit of least productive firms. This raised manufacturing productivity in Canada by over 4%. And then market share reallocation towards the more productive firms, which raised productivity by another 4.3%. So on account of these two mechanisms, you get a productivity improvement in excess of 8%, which is really a huge number. But this is sort of not the end of the story. In this other second paper, which by Lileva and Treffler, they also looked at additional effects, which are shown in the next three lines. So the first is that what happens to new exporters, whether generally speaking firms invest in productivity improvement. So the person who pioneered this type of calculation is Paula Bustos. She sits here. She didn't do it for Canada. She did it for Argentina. And what she showed was that if you take this analytical framework and you ask the question, when firms have an option to invest in new technologies in response to trade liberalization, which are the firms that will do it? So obviously, the least productive firms who serve only the domestic market, for them it's not a positive shock, so they will typically not invest in new technologies in response to trade liberalization. On the other hand, the firms which are quite productive and are already exported might respond to some degree by investing in technology improvement. But what Paula showed was that the biggest effect comes among the firms who are the most productive among the non-exporters, because they now switch to export. So they have the strongest incentive to invest in technology upgrading. And she showed that in Argentina, this is exactly what happened. And Treffler and Lileva showed that this exactly is what happened also in Canada. And this increased sectoral productivity in Canada by another 3.5%. And then the existing exporters also did some investment in Canada, so this increased it by another 1.4%. There was some improvement in imports of intermediate inputs. In Canada, it didn't play such a huge role. It's only 0.5 percentage point. But for example, in India, people who studied the Indian liberalization, this was the biggest actually effect. So in Canada overall, you get this productivity improvement, which is in excess of 13%, which is a huge number by any measure. And even if these estimates are not entirely accurate, and we always have to take them with a grain of salt, the numbers look extremely large by common standards of analysis. So this was sort of nice and appealing. We had a theoretical framework. We had evidence which shows that the framework is consistent with a lot of data, actually, for many countries, different episodes, and so on. But this last finding about the role of productivity improvement generated a controversy recently. So I have two little equations, but doesn't matter. I mean, I'll explain what they are. So last year, there was this paper by Arkolakis, Kostino, and Rodriguez-Clare that was published. And they essentially did an analysis which is actually a very nice, elegant analysis, where they showed that under a variety of conditions, including firm heterogeneity, but some assumptions that you have to make, you can show that the percentage change in welfare or real income is equal to the percentage decline in the fraction of spending on own goods by a country raised to some power. And the power is what we call through the trade elasticity. So this formula, it's obviously a correct formula. And then the question becomes, what's the interpretation of this formula? And here I think they faulted, because the interpretation that they pushed was that this shows that all these issues of heterogeneity and how they affect productivity of the type that I showed you earlier on are sort of irrelevant. All you need to know is by how much the share of spending on own goods has declined, or maybe it has increased. You'll have the negative effect and so on. And you need some estimate of this elasticity. The problem with this argument is not that it's analytically incorrect. Analytically, it's exactly right. But the interpretation, and what I mean by this is the following, that suppose you engage in some trade liberalization, then the degree to which spending on own goods will decline or increase is going to depend very much on these details. It's not independent. And there is this new paper by Melitz and Redding, which shows that if you take, even analytically, a model, and you start with two countries which look very much alike in terms of productivity, but they are closed economies, and the only difference is that one has these heterogeneous firms, has all distribution of productivity, the other doesn't. And now you ask the question, suppose we open up these countries to trade. Then obviously in the country which doesn't have this heterogeneity, we'll get the usual effects. In the country that has the heterogeneity, we'll get these productivity effects that I talked about before. And then there's the question, do we know, by calculating this change in the share of spending on own goods, by how much welfare will rise in one country as opposed to the other? And they showed analytically that it always rises more in the country with the heterogeneity. So if you calibrate carefully the analytical model to the right benchmark, then it's always the case that you get bigger gains from trade in the heterogeneous framework than in the homogeneous framework. Now, there is the second sort of formula has to do with allocation across sectors. So this, the first formula applies to the case where there's only one sector, like manufacturers say. But if you have many sectors, then you have to weight them. And then the issue becomes, if you get some resource reallocation, does it move, do resources move to the sectors where you get big drops in shares of spending on all goods or not, and whether these are sectors with high or low elasticity. So the whole thing becomes much richer. It's actually quite reminiscent of a very famous paper at the time. I know that Giacomo read it. I don't know if Paula read it, because I put it on the reading list. And this is a paper by Frank Graham, who was a professor of international trade in Princeton. It was published in 1923 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, in which he argued that if there are some increasing returns to scale, a country may not gain from trade, because when it opens up to trade, resources may move from sectors with, say, constant returns to scale to increasing returns to scale, and then this would be good for welfare gains, but it can happen that they move in the opposite direction, from increasing return sectors to constant return sectors, and then you lose the scale effect, and this can hurt productivity and may not be so good for welfare. And so this formula actually embodies indirectly this type of idea. To assess the sectoral effects, you basically need a sort of full model of the economists involved in order to do the calculations. So there is a nice paper that was published a couple of years ago by Ballisteri, Hilbery, and Rutherford. These are people who work with what we call computable general equilibrium models. So they have models of the world economy, essentially. And what they do is they calibrate them. They estimate some parameters. They guess some others. They try and make it fit data in a particular year. And then you can run counterfactuals. And when you run the counterfactuals, you can ask the question, what will happen if you reduce tariffs, for example? So in this particular exercise that I want to show you, or I've shown already in this table, and the numbers are sort of not important. They are small, but there's an explanation of why they are small. What they did was they took the manufacturing sectors of these countries. As you can see here, there's China, Japan, Canada, US, Mexico, and some others were bunched together into a region. Okay? And they asked the question, suppose we reduce tariffs on manufacturers into half their levels. So at the time, they were above 9%, so you reduce it by about 5%. What is it going to do? And what they did was they calibrated their model twice. Once, the way they worked with it all their life, which was a very standard neoclassical framework. And then the other, they introduced this firm heterogeneity into the manufacturing sector, but chose a distribution of productivity such that the average of this distribution is exactly the same like in the homogeneous case. And then they estimated the impact of this reduction in tariff in both cases. And essentially what these numbers show is that the gains from the tariff reduction under heterogeneity are about 4 times as high. And in their setup, it comes exactly from the fact that because they reduce tariffs on manufacturers, then other sectors like resource sectors, agriculture, they lose labor and other resources which move into manufacturing. You get an expansion of manufacturing, and in manufacturing you realize economies of scale. And you get this big boost to welfare. So there is a set of other studies which look at various issues. I don't have time to go over it because I want to move on. But let me mention a couple. So there is a very important paper by Bernard, Redding, and Schott in 2007, where they integrated Melitz-type industries into a general equilibrium model with factor proportions. And what they showed was that if you look at what trade does, if you open up to trade, is that productivity goes up in all industries, both in the industry that's a net exporter and the industry that's a net importer. So all of them go up. But then they proved the following very elegant result, that despite the fact that productivity goes up in both industries, in both countries, they looked at the world of 2 countries, what happens is that in each country, the productivity gain in its exportable sector is bigger than the productivity gain in its import competing sector. So if Spain is a capital-rich country, what it means is that Spain will be a net exporter of capital-intensive products, and by this result, its productivity as a result of trade will increase in the capital-intensive sector proportionately more than in the labor-intensive sector. You take another country like China, which is labor-rich, it exports labor-intensive products, productivity in China will go up proportionally more in the labor-intensive sector. Now, this is a very intriguing result. Why? Because the driver of trade here is essentially Heckscher and Dolin. They are not with us anymore, but you see they are still driving trade from time to time. However, the outcome is indistinguishable from Ricardo, because ex post, the relative productivities are exactly what Ricardo said will happen. So you get this mix of Ricardian and factor proportion effects. And this is a very nice result indeed. So I talked already about Paula's works. I won't repeat it. I know she would love me to repeat it, but we'll just leave it at it now. And then there are other things. Kalina Manova integrated financial constraints into this type of framework and showed how important they are for predicting trade and the sort of heterogeneity, how important it is when firms face financial constraints. There's some work that I did. This was when I was wearing jeans, with Mark Melitz and Yona Rubinstein, where we sort of extended this analytical framework to a very rich world with a lot of asymmetries. And the important thing there was that we showed how one can use such a rich framework in order to estimate an econometric model, which is a general, so to speak, model that generates gravity equations, which is what typically we use for estimating trade flows. And more importantly, how one can use this framework to estimate without biases. I mean, this is always temporary, these type of statements, yes? The separation between the intensive margin and the extensive margin of trade. So what is the intensive margin extensive? So you can look either across countries or across time, and you see a change in the volume of trade, and then you can decompose it, how much of it is due to the fact that there are more products, and how much of it is that there's a higher volume per product. So the former is the extensive margin, and the latter is the intensive. Obviously, in the neoclassical framework, we cannot talk about the extensive margin. And this is sort of important because in the data, more than half of the variation in trade flows is due to shifts in the extensive margin, which means the number of products. I could have spent a lot of time talking about this, but we are going to move on. When do I finish? Mr. Chairman.
We are quite happy to hear you all night.
All night, okay. I don't know, I think maybe you should ask the audience. So another set of issues that that played a big, in which these heterogeneity considerations played a big role, is work that has been done on wage inequality and also unemployment. But I'm going to talk only about wage inequality. So if you think about the relationship between foreign trade and wages, this literature has a long tradition. There's been a lot of work done on this, especially in the 1990s. This caught on when the college wage premium in the US doubled. And then in other countries, people found similar results, a big increase in the college wage premium. So again, I'm not going to spend much time talking about it, but I want to note the following. If you were to use, as people did at the time, this sort of neoclassical framework to think about wage inequality, by the nature of the analytical frameworks from which you start, all you can talk about is wage inequality across inputs that are either in different occupations, in different sectors, or are different from each other. For the former two, you need to make typically pretty strong assumptions, such as that there might be some rents. If there are no rents, then the only difference can be between workers with different characteristics. So this is the sort of key observation. Now, in the data, things are quite different. a lot of the wage inequality in the data is within sectors rather than across sectors. The other thing is a lot of it is within occupations rather than across occupations. And the most striking piece of evidence, which comes from labor economics, is that if you control for worker characteristics, so if Jaume is more educated than I am, or he has more experience in the labor market, he's going to get a higher wage in lieu of these two characteristics. But once you take this out, you ask what's happening with wages that remain. Most of the inequality doesn't come from the fact that he's smarter than I am in a way that we can measure, or more experience. Most of it comes from nowhere, and they called it residual wage inequality. So let me show you some evidence on this. So this table comes from work that my colleagues and I have done on Brazil. And what it shows you is that if you decompose wage inequality, and I'm not going to describe to you the details, what you find is that within occupations, the variation explains about 80% of the inequality, and the residual, which is 18% here, is across occupations. If you do it within and across sectors, you see that more than 80% is within sectors and a smaller residual across sectors. If you do it, what did I do? If you do it, is this? No, sorry. My apologies. If you do it across sector occupations, so you take a worker with a white-collar worker in a particular industry and compare him to a worker with a blue-collar worker, maybe possibly in a different industry, or maybe in the same industry, and you look at the variations across these cells, again, close to 70% is within the cells as opposed to across cells. And if you look at changes over time, then again, the second column shows you that the majority of the changes are within rather than across groups. I know that Torsten wanted to know what happens in Sweden. So here is what we find in Sweden. It's very similar. You know, Sweden and Brazil are not exactly the same countries. But nevertheless, the majority of the variation is within occupations, within sectors, within occupation sector cells, and also the change over time. So there are some differences between Sweden and Brazil. I don't have time to explain them, but this pattern, which is the underlying pattern, is very robust, it seems. So here, you don't control for worker characteristics. So the fact that Jaume is more educated than I am, or more experienced, is not factored in. So now I show you some numbers when you factor in this. So suppose you estimate the return to worker characteristics, like schooling and experience. And then you calculate the wage after you take out the contribution of these characteristics. And you ask, what happens with this residual? So what you see here is that the residual wage inequality is about 60%. This is in the Brazilian data. And of this 60%, about 90% of the variation is within sector occupations again. So this is after Jaume has been compensated for all the good characteristics that he has. And I know that he has many good characteristics. So it's fair that he gets a high wage. But what remains of all this is a lot of variation, what this shows it. And all this variation is concentrated within these cells. The same in Sweden. Okay, exactly the same. So you get a 70% residual, and about 80% of this 70 is variation within the group. So in any case, my colleagues and I, we wrote a couple of papers. One is this empirical paper from which I've taken these data. And the other is a theoretical paper that used this analytical framework to develop equilibrium structures that generate this type of variation. So I don't want to run over time too much, so I'm not going to describe these details. But what I'll describe is the following. So if you take this equilibrium structure, the way we have done it, you can translate it into a statistical model in a straightforward way. And then what you can do is you can estimate the model. So we have estimated this model on Brazilian data. And what these figures show is a fit between the data and what the model generates. So you take the statistical model that you estimated, and you generate with it data, and then you compare it to the actual data. So what I show you here is the distribution of wages. And what you see is that the blue line, look at the left panel, the blue line is the data, and the red line is the data that the model generates. And generally speaking, this type of fit is pretty unusual. Usually what we do is we just look at moments. We don't look at the entire distributions. And people are very happy when they fit the moments. But to fit the entire distribution, it's a number of degree more difficult. And sometimes we get lucky. So it looks like this. The other thing that you note here is that in the right panel, what you see is the separate distributions for wages among firms that serve only the domestic market in Brazil and firms that are exporters. So essentially what you hear is the broken lines are for the exporters. So what you see, the whole distribution for the exporters is to the right of the distribution for the domestic firms, which is a stronger statement than saying that wages are higher for exporters than non-exporters. And it will be similar if you made calculations of these distributions of productivity. So now you can ask the following question. If you have estimated a model like this, you can ask the question, how much inequality can this type of economy generate? Remember, we are talking about residual inequality. So it's not because one worker has more education or more experience than the other. They look alike after you reduce the contribution of worker characteristics to the data. So this is a sort of graph that I like very much. Why? Because what this graph shows is the following. Suppose that we are changing the cost of trade. And then we can ask how is going inequality to change when we change the cost of trade. Now on the horizontal axis, what we see is not the cost of trade, but the fraction of workers employed by exporters. So if you reduce the cost of trade, you get a higher fraction of people employed by exporters. So there's a one-to-one relationship here. But then you look at what happens to inequality, which is on the vertical axis, and you see this inverted U shape. So what this says is that if you take an economy which doesn't trade, it has huge barriers to trade, and you start reducing these barriers gradually, initially this will raise wage inequality. But as you continue to reduce the barriers to trade, eventually you hit a peak, and then it starts falling. So the relationship between trade and inequality is non-monotonic. And in the analytical paper that we wrote before we did the empirical work, we proved this as a general result. So we have this analytical result on the one hand, and we have the evidence in support of this non-monotonicity on the other. The red dot shows the inequality in Brazil in 1994, and this appears to be the peak of inequality that you can get. And those of you know, in Brazil in 1994, they implemented a big stabilization program, generated a huge appreciation of the currency, and they had a big trade collapse and so on. Okay. Okay, the last topic I want to discuss is multinational corporations. So take another 10 minutes, okay? Okay, so we distinguish between a number of three types, essentially, of multinationals. There are multinationals that arise, which we call horizontal multinationals. And these are firms which invest in foreign countries in order to serve the domestic market in the host country. Then we have these vertical multinationals, which invest in a foreign country in order to cheaply produce the inputs that they need. And then we have what we call complex multinationals. So these are multinationals for which these two motives are intertwined. So a firm may invest in Taiwan in order to build cheap components, but once it has the cheap components, it pays to invest in Japan in order to serve the Japanese market, bringing the components from Taiwan in order to produce in Japan. So this will be a sort of complex system. Now, in the data, there are a number of important things that one has to consider, because multinationals, they have to make decisions, or every firm has to make decisions in at least two dimensions. One is whether to integrate in the domestic market. The other is whether to outsource in the domestic market. So this is a case where the firm chooses to be in the domestic market, but has to choose between integration and outsourcing. So these are, or sometimes it's referred to as make or buy decision. It's a very common decision that firms have to make. But then the firm can go abroad. If it goes abroad, it can invest and get in the foreign country, or it can buy at arm's length the products from a non-affiliated firm. So because these four forms are very widespread, you need a pretty elaborate theory in order to account for them. So there has been a lot of work on this, and I know many of you probably attended Paul Antras's lectures, and he spent all his lectures talking about this stuff. So I'm just going to show you a few things, because it complements very nicely what I have talked about so far. So if you look at multinationals, they have become extremely important. So look here, look at the first row. So what you see is that in Finland, only 1.6% of the firms are subsidiaries of foreign multinationals. In Poland, it's bigger, it's 16. In Sweden, it's 2.8. But now look at the second row. You see this 1.6% of firm employs 17% of the labor force in manufacturing in Finland. And in Sweden, 32%. So obviously, you see they are much bigger than the average firm. And if you look at the last row, you see exports. They are also big exporters. And in the US data, they sort of dominate exports. It's just amazing how much they export. The other thing that you see is, look just at the first row, is that they all are engaged actually in complex integration. So for example, in manufacturing, what you see is that the subsidiaries sell more than half of their output, 55%, in the host country market. However, they export to to countries which are not the US. These are for US multinational in this table, about 1/3 of their output. And they also export back to the US, 11%. So they are essentially engaged in these complex integration strategies. So there has been a lot of work on this, and I'm going to jump over it. But I want to show you this figure, which comes from a chapter that Paul Antras and Steve Ippel wrote for the Handbook of International Economics. And these data are on Spanish firms. So what you see here is the following. You have three distributions, And these are distributions of productivity. So this is total factor productivity. And what you see, the leftmost distribution is for domestic firms. The next one is for exporters. No, don't make like this. If you do a Kolmogorov-Smirnov test, you reject the assumption that they are the same. Yeah. Okay, you are allowed to think. Then you see the most extremes are subsidiaries of multinationals or domestic multinationals. So you get this pecking order: domestic, exporters, multinationals. In the US data, for example, the multinationals have a productivity advantage over exporters, which is about 15%, labor productivity. And the exporters have a productivity advantage over domestic firms, which is about 40%. And this type of pecking order was found also in other data sets. So, for example, Paul and I, we wrote a couple of papers where we developed in detail predictions of this type. And the interesting prediction is this one. It looks like this. You get a very clear pecking order of firm behavior. So in the simple case from which I started, firms could choose either to be domestic or to also export. Now they have more choices. So what you see here is that the least productive firms have to leave the industry. Now, among those who remain, the most productive go abroad. So, but they go abroad in two different formats. Among those who go abroad, who offshore, these are firms that acquire their intermediate inputs from abroad. The most productive become multinationals, so they build their own facilities or acquire foreign facilities in order to manufacture the inputs. And the less productive, they outsource. So they do it offshore, but outsource. So they buy it from unaffiliated firms. Among the domestic firms, you also get this pecking order, that the more productive integrate, and the less productive outsource. And again, in various data sets, this is what you find. And if you look at the Spanish data, you look at the firms which are engaged in foreign transactions, they have a distribution to the right of the firms which are not engaged in foreign transactions. And then there is a bunch of tests of more refined nature that people have done, and I'm going to skip all this. So in closing, what I want to say is the following. That research in this area has been very active during all these years. And in a way, it has been a constant race between the economists and the events. You know? So it's unlike physics, nothing remains the same, and you have to sort of update all the time. It's, on the one hand, it's very exciting. On the other hand, it can be very frustrating, because you finish writing a paper after 3 years, and everything looks different at this point in time. So there has been sort of constant updating of the thinking on it, and the firm-level approach, which I try to introduce to you, has become the dominant mode of analysis of both international trade and foreign direct investment. And the last 10 years have seen a dramatic change in this field. It's really a revolution which was started by Mark Melitz. And I know for sure he wore jeans at the time, so Paul Krugman was right. And this research project just goes on simply because things are changing constantly. New data sets become available in different countries. There are more episodes that one can study. And all the students in the audience are invited to join the race. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elhanan. Now I'm going to take some questions from the audience. The floor is open.
Hi. The idea that exporters are very different than non-exporters, and in the current context, we should encourage Spain's economy is in dire straits. It's not in a good shape. We should encourage non-exporting firms to become exporters, right? That should be, from what you've said, it's a clear policy message that we should be sending. The idea is, are we going back to a Ricardo world in a sense where countries that are able or have the endowment, the possibility to change, to make firms more flexible in their size, relative to their size, to increase the size of firms, be able to compete in this new order or something?
Yeah, I wouldn't, I'm not sure that this is what one should conclude from it. The conclusion is not that the government should encourage the firms to become bigger, say, and more. There may be reasons to subsidize R&D, for example, because it generates externalities. But just to go and subsidize firms to become bigger or to become exporters, this type of analysis does not justify. So this is not something you really want to conclude from it.
I was thinking maybe more about the type of regulation. I was thinking more about along the lines of excessive regulation that might be hampering firm growth, which is an area where maybe governments can better act.
Yeah, so this is quite possible. So we know, for example, from some work that has been done, if you look at labor market rigidities, if you can manage to reduce them, this is going to give you a competitive edge. But this has the undesirable effect that's going to hurt your trade partners. So this is a beggar thy neighbor type policy. On the other hand, if these rigidities exist in both countries, there is a way to reduce them in both countries or in many countries so that everybody will come out ahead. So yes, there are cases where you can identify institutional features that by changing them, you get better outcomes. But I would be very reluctant to make sort of general statements about it. Yeah.
In your presentation, you have focused on the effects of trade liberalization, i.e. reduction of tariffs. Are there reasons to believe why the effects may not be symmetric, i.e. an increase in tariffs or some protectionism may have different effects, or you would expect everything to be symmetric, i.e. entry of low productivity firms, say, and etc.?
Well, so the answer depends on flexibility. I mean, if there are no restrictions and everything is flexible, then it's completely symmetric. But if there are rigidities, then of course there's going to be some asymmetries. I also focused mainly on what we call multilateral liberalization. So if you go to unilateral liberalization, things are more complicated. I didn't talk about it, but it becomes more complicated. But generally speaking, if everything is flexible, and the only type of distortions in the system are from monopolistic competition, entry, exit, and so on, because of the fixed cost, then it is completely symmetrical. Now, if you think about more realistic frameworks, then there are some interesting issues. So, for example, suppose you have there's some rigidity in the labor market, and then you have unemployment insurance. The question is, how high do you want the unemployment insurance to be? So what you can show that in this type of environments, the best you can do is combine some labor market policies with some interventions in commodity markets. Why? Because of the monopolistic competition, you get some distortions there due to the markups. In the labor market, you get some distortions because you don't satisfy some of the standard conditions, like the Hosios conditions in the labor market. But this, again, it doesn't justify necessarily high unemployment insurance. In fact, the opposite can be the case. And then you can design a package which combines these things together. So competitiveness in the product market depends, excuse me, depends on labor market frictions or competitiveness in the labor market. And you have to think about it as a package. If you try to push one margin, then, due to this general theorem of the second best, you may not do well. But again, this is, a little bit off track.
Just a quick question. It seems that heterogeneity in productivity, or differences in productivity across firms, plays a central role in these new theories of trade. Now, to what extent you and other researchers in the field feel comfortable about this? Or in other words, what's really behind those differences in productivity? I mean, why can a firm, is this standing for something, or shall we literally think of it as differences in say, TFP, in production methods? Can't firms just replicate others' technology, or do you have more in mind, someone coming up with a very good idea that generates a lot of utility for consumers, and others having restricted entry in order to produce that through patents or something? I mean, what is behind this in your view?
Well, as you know, in the data, there is a lot of variation in productivity. I mean, this is just a fact in the data. So I'll give you a two-pronged answer to this. So if you want to stay in this framework, then it makes a lot of sense that when a firm develops, say, a product or a technology for a new product, there is some random element in the outcome. Then obviously the firm can add to it by investing some more, making ex post adjustment, which is going to change the distribution again. So there are some models which have this two-stage process. You get an initial productivity outcome, and then you change it by investing. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of what I said can be done with demand shocks instead of productivity shocks. So if you take the simplest framework, you can do all of Melitz with demand shocks. So people demand for you develop a product, and I develop a product. We both have the same technology, but people fall in love with your product rather than mine. And this is going to generate also heterogeneity and similar type of outcomes. So in principle, you can have a mix of demand shocks and supply shocks with consequences which are not that far from each other. But generally speaking, yes, I think most of us think that there is some underlying productivity. It can come, for example, you can think about a richer environment. Suppose that firms are constructed by entrepreneurs. And some entrepreneurs prove to be more successful than others. So the firm has a high productivity because this is the guy who's running the firm. This is fine too. So you can combine a Lucas-type model with this, and this will do as well. So I cannot copy your management skill. I mean, you run Cray so well that if we were to swap positions, Cray would be in big trouble. Yes? So that's fine too. All of these versions are fine. Huh?
So
So if you think about, say, trade liberalization happening, so for instance, if we take the example of India who wants to liberalize the retail sector, so analytically thinking, you have a huge number of, say, very unproductive single-person firms. So can you tell me something about what would be distributional consequences of such a policy?
Me personally?
Would your theory tell you something about how you could think about, assuming there are no redressal mechanisms, that you gain, you can't compensate me, the loser? What would you say as a government would you think about such a policy?
I don't know. I don't want to talk about things I don't know. What we know about India, right, is that the 1991 trade liberalization generated big effects. And in India, it didn't really work exactly out in this way. It has to do quite a lot with the type of products that are being produced. So for example, the tariff reductions in India on final goods had a minor effect on productivity and all that. But the tariff reductions on intermediate inputs had very big effects. Now, India has many other problems. So for example, there's a recent study that looked at management practices in India. I don't know if you read the paper. There's this paper where they brought consultants to a sample of Indian firms, and they taught them all the tricks of management. And when they applied them, their productivity went up. But then after a while, many of these firms basically got rid of these new management techniques and went back to their old ways. So I have no explanation for these type of things, yes.
So most of the evidence that you showed in the lecture came from manufacturing, as is most of the evidence in international trade. But you also said that trade was basically a race between the theories and the empirics and the real world. So nowadays that you see more and more trade in services, I was wondering where you saw the discipline going, if it's integrating that or I mean, in general, whether that could be an active area of research.
Right. So yes, trade in services has become a big item. It's now exceeds $3 trillion. But we don't have the type of data that we have for manufacturers for services. It's just not available. So I'm not aware of detailed studies of this type for the service sectors. And obviously, these $3 trillion, they cover all of this of services, which is financial services, engineering services, accounting services, and all that. Services, by the way, in the US data, it's one of the fastest growing out items. It's very small relative to trade and manufacture, but it's growing very fast. And yeah, we just don't have this type of data. So if you can find data like this, we'll be very eager to see what you find.
Very good. It's taken quite a bit of time. If there is any final question, I'll take it. If not, I would like just to thank Elhanan Helpman for his presentation and the time with us, and pass the word to Tomas to conclude the event.
Thank you very much, Professor Helpman, and thank you, Professor Ventura. Now, thank you very much to all of you for your attendance and attention. Now we can share some cover reception in the foyer next door, if you wish, and we'll have the opportunity to share more thoughts and conversations there. So thank you, and see you next time. Thank you.